Good morning, class. Professor Orozco here. Welcome to Logic this summer. And good morning, class. Welcome to Logic. And this is an introductory video to kind of give you an overview of what we're going to be doing in this class. What are we going to be doing in Logic? And it's a good question because you've never probably taken a logic class before, right? You need critical thinking units to get your degree or to graduate, but you're not probably sure of what you're getting in this class. Logic. Most classes that you take in college, you've had some previous version of that class in high school. So you've taken probably high school biology. If you get to Southwestern, if you get to state and you take a biology class, you have a basic idea that you're going to be studying about osmosis and mitochondria and the cell and membranes and things like that. So you've already had a version of that class. And same thing if you had taken history in high school. Now you take a history class in college and you know the drill. But logic, you've probably never taken a class like this. So what are we going to do in this class, right? Logic. You know something about what the word means, right? Logic. It has to do with reasoning or thinking, logic. You know when somebody's being illogical, you say to somebody, man, you're crazy. Man, you're acting crazy. So you know that that's illogical. If somebody says to you, you know what, let's go out and get tacos at 3 o'clock in the morning in TJ. You might say, I don't know, man. That's a little bit late. You're sounding illogical. So you kind of know that logic has to do with reason and thinking. And sometimes you'll hear an argument that sounds really logical, and sometimes you'll hear something that sounds illogical. So you already have a basic idea. You have a little antenna that God gave you or nature gave you that kind of said, that sounds like a good idea. And other things don't sound like a good idea. And your brain is basically assessing logic, the rationality of the idea. So we're dealing with arguments. That's what we're basically going to do in this class. What makes a good argument and what makes a fallacy? That's what we ultimately do in this class. Now we'll also be looking at, what the state of California requires for a logic class, meaning that we have to look at what deductive reasoning is. Doesn't that sound kind of intimidating? What is deductive reasoning? And we'll have to look at inductive reasoning, and we'll have to look at the syllogism, and we'll have to look at fallacies. And those are all good things, and they're theoretical. But the main thing to keep in mind is that we're trying to look at arguments. And there's a hell of a lot of arguments going on in the country right now. There always have been, whether they're dealing with race, whether they're dealing with economics, whether they're dealing with gender, whether they're dealing with education, the prison system, environment. There's always arguments. There's always been historical arguments about society, and there's contemporary arguments. There's social media arguments. Is that a good thing? Do they absorb people? Do they kind of contribute to people's poor self-esteem? When police shootings happen or a police brutality, we argue whether the police have exceeded their limits and their authority by bringing harm or even death to the person that they're arresting. So there's all kinds of arguments to consider, and that's what we're going to be doing in this class. So keep that in mind, that we're going to have some theoretical things that we're going to do in the class when we look at the nature of an argument and we look at its structure, like what's the premise of the argument. We'll do this when we start looking in chapter 3, the syllogism. So what's the premise of the argument? What's the main driving concept of an argument? And then we'll look at the minor premise and the conclusion. So we'll be doing theoretical analysis of what an argument looks like from a theoretical point of view, and you'll have to be patient as we go through that. The state of California wants us to look at the theoretical aspects of logic and thinking. But the real bread and butter of this class, the thing that I really like and I hope that you connect with, and maybe it's the reason why you said, you know what, I'm going to take Orozco. I've heard of him before. Or, I'm hoping that there's been some good word about it. But you know that probably the reputation that I have is to try to talk about things, try to keep it real, try to talk about things that are legit, and try to talk about things that have value and meaning. So let's take an example of an argument. It's the kind of thing that we'll probably be doing in the class. So why not give you a little sample, like a little Baskin Robbins little plastic spoon, a spoonful of the ice creams, because I kind of want that. So let's do that for a second. And I do want to talk about like the issue that's on everybody's mind. Well, there's two issues, right? COVID-19, how could that not be? And there's all kinds of economic and social and dating impacts on that. Like, how do you have a life right now with COVID-19? That's a huge issue right now. Some of you have been impacted. You've been in your home. I know I have. That's one big issue. And the obvious one is police brutality, which has been going on for decades and decades and decades. And the real kicker, or the real kind of like flashpoint, is cell phones. Because cell phones, I don't know if you'd argue with me, that would be a premise that I would give to you as kind of like one of the main drivers of all of this stuff is technology and cell phones, because without that, we would not have seen this incident. It would have remained as a local kind of tragedy in Minnesota. But now that people have phones and they can upload whatever they see, this is what is creating the national dialogue that we've seen. So technology has kind of made police brutality come to the front and center of our national kind of dialogue. And so one of the things to ask is whether the protests have been effective. And because you can imagine many people in middle America are concerned. They're seeing all kinds of rioting. They're seeing police cars burning. They're seeing banks being burned down. They're seeing stores being vandalized. That certainly happened right here in downtown. It happened in La Mesa. There were people protesting in Santee. They were protesting throughout San Diego and up in LA and up in Sacramento and in the Bay Area. I mean, it's just been a nationwide type of thing. But a lot of people are asking, and here's the argument that I would like to consider with you, is whether the protests have really harmed their message by degenerating into violence. I wish we were kind of on a Zoom right now so we could kind of, get some back and forth on this. But let me just, keep it on my screen here and just ask you a question. Has that harmed the message? Well, there's all kinds of things that you can answer, right? If we use critical thinking and logic, we could say, yeah, there's plenty of people that are now turned off to the George Floyd murder. They're saying, listen, I think it's a tragedy, but y'all went crazy, and now I'm off the team. I'm off that bandwagon. But I want to ask you a question. Let's do some critical thinking. I want to ask you a question. If the protests had not gotten a little bit violent, and I'm not justifying it, I'm just saying if the protest had been kind of like vanilla pudding, tapioca pudding, white bread, had not gotten angry, would we see any kind of change? Because people have been protesting peacefully for years. When Colin Kaepernick started to kneel down in 2017, I believe, when he started to take a kneel during the national anthem during NFL football games, that was peaceful. That was a peaceful process or a peaceful protest. What changed? Since 2017, we've had murder after murder after murder. Alton Sterling, Laquan McDonald, Breonna Taylor. We've had another person killed in Minnesota, Philando Castile. We've had Eric Garner. We've had Michael Brown. We've had all kinds of people killed, and the killing still goes on. And so those were all peaceful protests. I'm wondering if people hadn't gotten really angry and really made people uncomfortable, if we would be seeing things like we're starting to see today. For instance, the city of San Diego just decided that they were going to outlaw chokeholds. Now, for you to even think that a police department would have that as part of their repertoire, as something that they used as their methods for subduing something, is already kind of crazy. I saw this report that said that the Minnesota police had caused the 44 incidents of people to lose consciousness when they applied a chokehold. That's somebody who, because of lack of blood circulation to their brain, pressure on the carotid artery, lost consciousness. And that's just not a simple matter of like the old wrestling hold. Oh, I put him to sleep. We used to practice that when we were little kids. Oh, let's put a little sleeper hold on you. But that's kind of an ignorant thing to do. You're cutting blood supply off to the brain. So I would ask you, if the protest had just stayed vanilla, had just stayed kind of like, hey, we're angry about this, but let's just continue to have a dialogue, would there be real change in the country? A couple of years ago, there was a huge shooting at a school in Florida, Parkland High School, and students came out in mass protest throughout the country, 15 and 16-year-olds. But guess what? They were pretty calm, and nothing happened with the gun lobby. Not even some, and I'm kind of shifting topics here a little bit, but you'll see the nature of what I like to do in this class. Even after this mass shooting at Parkland in Florida, and a couple of years earlier, when we had that mass shooting out at Sandy Hook in Connecticut, when a bunch of kids, 26 kids got killed. Um, Adam Lanza, I think his name was. Even after a mass shooting like that, very little happened because people basically said, oh, we're outraged and we're going to go visit Obama on the White House steps and we're going to shed some tears. And it's really sad. But do you all know that in most states, it's only in a couple of states throughout all 50 states that there's even a 7 or 10-day waiting period. We don't even have that as a national policy for gun control. For instance, and this is an interesting thing, I'll come back to the rioting in a minute. It's an interesting thing. If I have a restraining order on me in California, I've done some crazy stuff, and now somebody doesn't even want me anywhere near them. I've got a 100-foot restraining order. Can't make contact with another person. If I went to Sports Authority or if I went to some other gun store and tried to get a gun in California, they would do a 7 or 10-day waiting period, and they would say, you've got a restraining order on you, or you've had some other issue that pops up, and so now we can't issue you a gun. But that wouldn't be a problem because there's so many loopholes in the system, even despite all the murders that we have every year by handguns. Sometimes 13 to 17,000 people die each year as a result of a gun. We're not even talking about suicides, which is about another 17,000 per year. Just on the use of a handgun, whether it's murder or an accident or an accidental shooting, about 13,000 to 14, it depends on each year, 13 to 14,000 people die each year as a result of a gun. So we know there's all kinds of injuries that happen because of a weapon. And the interesting thing is that doesn't seem to move the needle at all. So in California, we're a little bit more of a progressive state, and so we do have a waiting day period. But even if I had a restraining order on me in California, all I'd have to do is drive an hour, 2 hours and a half to Yuma, Arizona, and I could walk into a gun shop and buy a gun in Yuma, Arizona, come back across the border, the state line, back into California. All they really do when you cross the state line in Arizona is ask you if you have any fruit. I could have a gun in my trunk and come back into California, and now I'm a person with a restraining order, and now I have bought a legal gun in California. So you can see that mild protest has not really moved the needle in terms of gun control, because that protest has usually been animated and it's painful, and a lot of parents cry and high school students come out and mobilize, but nothing really happens. But some of the things that are starting to happen right now with people being angry, and a lot of people, a huge cross section, because it's not Black Lives Matter. There's all kinds of people that are involved in the protests, young, old, white, black, all kinds of gender preferences, all kinds of people, all kinds of ethnicities, and all kinds of personal creed or personal religion. All kinds of people are out on the street right now, and it's scaring people, and it's uncomfortable. It has created an uncomfortable dialogue. So my argument to you, it's kind of like an open kind of argument, is would things start to change like the chokehold in San Diego? If people had not been pissed off in La Mesa, and I'm not justifying their anger, I'm not justifying violence, but if they had not gotten to the point where they had gotten enraged like that, do you think the city of San Diego would have modified their chokehold policy? In other words, if it had just been more polite conversation, hey, we're asking the police politely, would you look into your policies? As a result of these protests, now more states are requiring the use of body cams. Body cams, because do you know that in some states, some policemen don't even have to use body cameras? It just depends what state you're in and what county you're in. And so there's now a push, a national push, that body cams be not only on the police officer, but operable. Because how many times have you heard, yeah, we had our body cameras on, but they didn't work. They weren't operable. And so now we're seeing citizen oversight boards. There's a discussion about that. There's a discussion now, as a result of painful protests, that when the National Guard is brought into a city, that they have to be a local National Guard, let's say from California, because what some critics have been saying is that why would you want a bunch of National Guard people from Texas, which has a different mindset, coming over to police a city in California? So there's even a discussion now that would say if the National Guard is mobilized, it has to be from a local unit, from a local region, as opposed to having somebody come in from Arizona. I don't know about you, but I don't know if I'd like to be downtown at a peaceful protest and have National Guardsmen come in who are from Arizona. So that's a discussion that's happening. And it's a discussion that's happening because people are pissed and people got really angry. And peaceful protests like Colin Kaepernick did for years didn't do anything. As a matter of fact, it just made people in middle America pissed. And that's why to this day, he has not been able to get in the NFL. And the curious thing is that now everybody's coming around back to Colin Kaepernick, because when things were peaceful, when he was simply kneeling down, not out of disrespect to the flag, but out of respect for the First Amendment. That's what the flag represents, the ability to protest, the ability to say something. You're not breaking property. You're not attacking anybody. You're making people uncomfortable, but that's the purpose of a protest, is to make you uncomfortable. If you were comfortable, you'd say, I don't have to change. I don't have to change at all. So it's just a really interesting discussion, and it's an argument that I'm making to you is that even though it's kind of painful what has happened, and that there's been loss of life, attack on officers, nobody is justifying looting and vandalism. Nobody's doing that. But I would ask you a question, and maybe it's a basic argument. Would change have started to result without real anger? That's an interesting question. And so those are the kind of things that I like to talk about in class. I'd also like to talk about, education. I'd like to talk about the death penalty. I'd like to talk about the high school to prison pipeline. I'd like to talk about race. I'd like to talk about propaganda. I'd like to talk about the media. Are we going to be able to do that in 7 weeks? Hell no. That's just not going to happen. But I would like to use logic, which Aristotle actually describes as the tool. It's kind of interesting that the description of the book that he wrote, Aristotle, called the Organon, the title, the translation, the Latin translators of his book called his book, when they named it in Latin, the Organon, which means the instrument. It's kind of interesting because logic itself is not really a body of investigation. It's not really a thing. It's a tool to apply to an argument, which is kind of an interesting take. So anyway, I'm talking too much. You're going to see a lot of things during this class. Some are theoretical. We look at the syllogism. We look at deductive arguments and inductive arguments. We're going to look at fallacies. We're going to look at argument types. Yes. But the main thing to keep in mind is what we want to do is we want to analyze arguments that are out there in society that are pertinent and really, have a lot to do with the quality of our life.